So I work for Defense for Children International, and I'm really honored to be taking part in these conferences with the Tree of Life. Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening to what I have to say. Earlier this morning, during prayer, we kept on mentioning just the word justice with peace, and justice is a very important word. It's one of the two pillars that define the work that we do. We do justice for children, and we try to provide protection for them from abuse. Justice for children restores their human security and dignity, and protection for children prevents further violations of their rights. And both justice and protection demand holding perpetrators accountable and combating impunity. And that's sort of the theme of my talk, combating impunity and holding perpetrators accountable. Many of these Palestinian children have gone through so much trauma. Many of these children have gone through so much trauma in their life that unless we could hold their perpetrators accountable, and unless we could find them some sense of justice, it'll be really hard to get them through that trauma. And because the trauma itself, to replace that trauma, like I was saying, you need to replace you need to restore human security and dignity for them. In the West Bank so far this year, and I'll jump to Gaza in the second half of my talk, but in the West Bank so far this year, we've had 9 children killed by live ammunition in the West Bank by Israeli forces. Just this Thursday, Israeli forces fatally shot a 12-year-old boy in the chest in Beit Lakia. Baha el-Din Samir Badr, 12, was killed by a bullet to his chest after Israeli soldiers raided Beit Lakia, southwest of Ramallah, on the evening of Thursday, October 16th. Israeli soldiers bombarded the village with tear gas and ammunition. According to eyewitness testimony, 3 Israeli military jeeps entered Beit Lakia at around 5 p.m. The raid resulted in confrontations between Israeli forces and local youths. Eyewitnesses said that about 18 soldiers were present in the village when Bahat was shot. One bystander told DCI Palestine that Bahat was returning home from playing on the football field and had not been involved in the clashes at the time he was fatally shot. This, of course, the Israeli police completely contradicts and says that Bahat was involved, and that's why they shot him. Of course, they say that they used a sponge-tipped plastic grenade that they fired at his legs. And therefore aren't responsible for his death. But when he showed up at hospital, he had a bullet wound to the chest and a bullet wound to the head. And he had died from bleeding profusely. The exact circumstances remain something we continue to investigate. But what this points out is even if Israel had used the sponge-tipped plastic grenade that they claim they used, and which they say is a non-lethal crowd control weapon, it clearly can kill. And then Palestinian children are frequently killed and injured by the use of excessive force, and that includes these crowd control weapons, and it also includes live ammunition. And under this policy of impunity, none of the soldiers implicated in these incidents have been held to account. The Israeli military's own regulations dictate that live ammunition may only be used under circumstances of real mortal danger, but the regulations are not enforced and frequently ignored by Israeli soldiers. The international community has regularly expressed concern over the use of live ammunition by Israeli military forces. However, the use of live ammunition by Israeli soldiers to fire at unarmed Palestinian children during demonstrations is an increasingly common occurrence throughout the occupied West Bank. And with that, I actually would like to show you this video. Is it turning on? Sorry. So essentially what happened is on May 15th, the Palestinians were marking Nakba Day. It's the day that It's what Palestinians call the catastrophe. It's the day that they lost their land. And it's the day that the occupation came into power. And during that demonstration in Betunia, local youth clashed with Israeli soldiers. But during a lull in the fighting, and when the youths were posing zero danger to the Israeli soldiers, shot and killed two Palestinian. One was 16 and one was 17. What this video will show you is the impact of one of those victims, Mohammed Abu Daher, and how his family has been handling his there is, at some point in the footage, we were able to capture CCTV footage of the exact moment when he was shot. It's appear in this video, and it might be disturbing to some, so I just wanted to give that as a warning. Please.
أخوي موجود هون، قتلوا الاحتلال، كان عنده 16 سنة. كنا نلعب أنا وياه على الصبر، كان يدربنا على الفوتبول، كان لعيب محترف لعب الفوتبول، يعني أنا شاب منيح وكان بدير بال علي. أخوي الكبير خير خاطر محمد.
واحد يعني من الموت يعني في هذيك اللحظة القضاء يعني صدموا يعني أنا منيت يعني أنا دائما كنت أحكي يا رب يعني اختبر ناس في محمد بعيد أنا لما أكون لحالي في البيت وأشوف أغراض محمد يعني هاي درس محمد أنا حبيت يعني أحطهم كل يوم أفكر فيه وهي الموضوعات أنا أفكر لأن لبسه هاي لسه راح عليه أنا يعني ما بديش أوصلها لآخر البيت يعني الشوق يعني شغلة مش بسيطة ومش أي حد يقدر يعني إنه يقاومها ويتعايش معها بس الشغل يعني الصبر.
يعني هلا أنا مش عارف كيف ممكن أقاوم المنظر والمقام مع محمد. هاي الصورة أول اللي أصر إني أشوفها، كنت راضي أشوفها، كثير رح ارتاح أشوفها. كنت راضي فعلا لما شفتها كيف ارتحت. راح الصورة هو نايم ومش بس نايم ومرتاح. حياة الأب بعد فقدان الابن تستمر نعم، لكن وجع دائم ووجع غريب ورهيب ولا يمكن وصف ولا يمكن وصف. طبعا هذا أول رمضان يجي محمد مش معنا، لحظة الفطور كانت قاسية جدا جدا ومؤلمة جدا جدا.
هل كنا نخطط كنا مثلا أي رحلة يعملها في البلد كان يجي هو وأصحابه كنا لما نشوي هو وأصحابه يعني ننزل بالفلك حد أمراء كان يجي معنا تعرف كان يفضل مع الإخوة هو أخوي يحكي يلا يا رب معه كانت آخر فترة قبل ما استشهد بكم شهر اتفقنا أن نعمل أعمال تطوعية في بلدنا فعملنا نظفنا المقبرة آخر فترة يعني نذكرها فيه ونظفنا بالبلد ونحكي فيه دائما الله خلاص على خير إنه هو كان يعني يمشي معي كثير صاحب على خير باجي هون وبقعد زي على البيت أحس بكون شايفني وبحبش يخليني أطول هون بدري محمد الله يرحمه
محمد بالمناسبات الوطنية كان كثير وقت عندها. من هاي المناسبات 15/5 ذكرى النكبة، وهي كانت تمريج كبير جدا لمحمد. وجه لمعسكر أوطن في منطقة بدونيا رمضان، شارك مع الشباب، ما راح 200 و300 و1000 و2000 وشكلوا هجوم على الجنود الإسرائيلي، حتى حملوا الحجر هذا الصغير. يعني محمد عارف ومدرك تماما انه لن يؤذي هذا الجند اللي يبعد عنه مئات الامتار. نسبة تشكيل خطر على الجنود الإسرائيليين كانت صفر، ما كان يشكل أي خطر على الجنود. لذلك محمد قتل بدم بارد. ليلة مساء شهر محمد كنت سمعنا وياه هون، فبحكي لي عن طموحه، شو بفكر هو، شو بيدرس. فشلي على جامعة بيزيد، حكى أنا بدي أدرس في جامعة بيزيد صحافة وإعلام. بس ليش اخترت هذا التخصص؟ بحكي لي إنه أنا من خلال هذا التخصص بإمكاني أوصل للعالم إنه في شعب بيقاوم مقاومة مشروعة، وأطالب العالم إنه يخلصونا من هذه الدول.
عمليا رحل يعني انتقل لعالم آخر، بس هو فعليا موجود يعني تقلبنا تأكلنا.
يعني أنا بستاكل كثير، عقلي بيخرب يوم ما أصير أفكر فيه، لأني بحبه وكثير مشتاق له. يعني خلص بكون أفكر بشغلة بطل أفكر ولا شغلة، بطل أفكر فيه هو.
محمد ابني ما كانش الأول، مش رح يكون الأخير في مسلسل القتل اللي بمارسه الاحتلال الإسرائيلي تجاه أطفالنا. وإسرائيل دائما ما بتعترف بجرائمها، نصل من جرائمها، والعالم يجب الردود إليه. كل الأطفال في فلسطين ومنهم ابن محمد يحلموا وعندهم طموح زي كل الأطفال في العالم. محمد كان طموحه وحلمه البسيط إنه يكبر ويبني مستقبل، لكن الاحتلال الإسرائيلي برصاصته الغادرة أنهى هذا.
It's been hard for our staff dealing with both. We saw only one of the families. The other family has had an equally traumatic experience, and both of them are seeking justice. And while the Israeli authorities said they are investigating the incidents, they happened on May 15th, and we're now in October, and there's still been no result of the investigation. So the family is still seeking justice for the death of these two youths. When the war in Gaza erupted, it sparked solidarity marches and demonstrations in the West Bank. And a lot of the focus was on the Gaza Strip. And so people just sort of didn't realize what was also going on in the West Bank. But it was during this time that at least 4 Palestinians, one as young as 14, were also killed, and countless others were injured during this time. And in fact, actually, during one of these demonstrations, a staff member of Defense for Children International Palestine in Beit Umar, the village he's from near Hebron in the West Bank, was participating in a demonstration, and he was standing about 100 meters, which is roughly 300 feet, from the nearest soldiers, and a sniper basically shot him with live ammunition, single bullet to the heart. And he passed away. And that's something that our staff has also been struggling with. And from everything we've been able to conclude from our own investigation, which was also corroborated by Human Rights Watch, we believe he was unlawfully killed and that he was targeted for his human rights work. He was targeted as a human rights defender. So both the children who are living these difficult circumstances and those that are trying to expose the violations happening to them are in danger when they do so. And with that, I will move on to Gaza and say that no group has been more traumatized during Israel's 50-day war on Gaza than the children. They represent roughly half of Gaza's population and died at a rate of 10 a day every day during the conflict. The UN says 504 people have been killed, 504 children under the age of 18 have been killed during the Gaza war. We've been able to verify 475 of them. The vast majority of them are actually 14 or younger, and that's because 43% of Gaza's population is under the age of 14. So the likelihood of killing a child would be inevitably high. And, you know, while discussing these things, there were several issues that really struck me about a few children. There was one child who was used as a human shield in Gaza, another child who became orphaned as a result of the conflict, and then a parent who had to struggle with a very difficult decision. These are the three stories I would like to share with you now. So the use of civilians as human shields is prohibited under international law and involves forcing civilians to directly assist in military operations or using them to shield military objects or troops from attack. Most people forget that first part of what it means to be used as a human shield, which is to directly assist in military operations. And that's exactly what happened to Ahmed Abu Rada, who was at the time 16. He was 4 weeks shy of his 17th birthday when he was taken. And then, so he was... Ahmed was, we found Ahmed in a state of shock. We spoke to him about 2 weeks after Israeli soldiers had released him after they were done using him for human shields for 5 days. And we spoke with him over a period of 2 weeks to try and get the full story out of Ahmed, and without trying to make him relive through the experience. So it was difficult to try and get the information. Ahmed was from Khuza'a, near the southern Gaza town of Khan Yunis, and he was taken from his family on July 23rd. He was forced at gunpoint to search for tunnels for 5 days, even though he had no idea where any Hamas tunnels might be or any other tunnels might be, during which time he was interrogated, verbally and physically abused, and deprived of food and sleep. Ahmed told DCI Palestine in sworn testimony that Israeli soldiers attempted both to extract information from him regarding Hamas members and to recruit him as an informant before releasing him on July 27th. What's interesting also is, for example, one thing they did to Ahmed on the first day that they arrested him is they made him strip down to his underwear, and he stayed in his underwear for the next 5 days. So whenever he was searching for tunnels, being sent down sewers, he was naked, practically naked throughout that time. Whenever he didn't find any tunnels, the commander of the unit, the Israeli commander of the unit, would get very upset, and at certain times had a wire cable that he would lash at the kid's back. An Israeli army spokesman told the New York Times that they arrested Ahmed because they suspected him of being a Hamas militant, noting, and this is the part that really gets me, noting his father works for the Hamas Ministry of Tourism. So if his 16-year-old son, if his father worked for the Hamas Ministry of Tourism, then his son must be a Hamas militant. In Gaza, that would mean that every single child would probably be at risk as a result. While Israel claims to have opened an investigation into Ahmed Abu Rada's case, no Israeli investigator has even contacted Ahmed or his family to gather information concerning his use as a human shield. And what we continue to see, and as I said, my theme here is a clear pattern exists of Israeli soldiers using children as human shields in violation of their own domestic law and, of course, international law, and with complete impunity and with no accountability. We've actually at DCI documented 20 other cases over the years where children were used in a similar fashion as human shields. And in all except one, most of the perpetrators were not held to account. In the one case where the perpetrators were held to account, the severity of their sentence was a demotion in rank and a 3-week suspension. And it's that makes the Israeli military, the Israeli soldiers feel that they could get away with it. And if they could get away with it and no one's there to hold them accountable, then why change their way? Why change their practices? The next story is, of course, the story of Ala Balata. Ala Balata is one of 1,500 of Gaza's children who have been orphaned. When asked by Defense for Children International Palestine consultant what happened, Ala just gestured toward the heap of rubble that was his uncle's home. They were sitting on plastic chairs in a dirty alley flanked by cinder block walls, a familiar scene in any Palestinian refugee camp. But here in the heart of Jabalia, the path was strewn with shrapnel, the same dense metal that tore through every member of Ala's immediate family on the afternoon of July 29th. Ala says, and I'll read from him, it was the second day of Eid. A day earlier, on the first day of the Muslim feast, marking the end of Ramadan, Ala's father decided to move the family to his brother's house, which was deep inside the camp and farther from the Israeli tanks shelling everywhere along the Gaza's border. Ala says he thought we would be safer there. And what emerged out of the Gaza war was there was actually no safe place that parents could take their children whatsoever. What happened to the Balatas next speaks to the defining truth in Israel's war of one army. It is that no logic could spare the innocent. Children especially had no refuge, despite their parents' best efforts to shield them. And even if they had a calculus, a way to hedge against the fixed wings or the drones, that formula failed when the tanks came. Although the sheer number of artillery strikes was astounding, what made this Israeli tactic so devastating was its randomness, say military experts. On August 27th, the day after an open-ended ceasefire was announced in Gaza, U.S. military officials called the shelling of Shuja'iyya, the eastern Gaza town largely leveled by Israeli artillery fire, absolutely deadly, and meant only to kill a lot of people in as short of a period of time as possible. They had every reason to be shocked. That same day that an Israeli artillery attack killed at least 17 people in the crowded market in Shuja'iyya, a United Nations school in Jabalia was also hit, killing 19. The July 30 attacks followed earlier barrages of artillery fire, including a 7-hour onslaught that, according to a Pentagon briefing, pumped 4,800 shells into a single neighborhood. Speaking to the media, Lieutenant General Robert Gard said, "The rate of fire over the period of time is astonishing. If the figures are even half right, Israel's response was absolutely disproportionate." When Ala finally gets over the fact that his entire family was annihilated, he goes on to talk about his 8-year-old brother. He says he clung to the hope that Yahya, his 8-year-old brother, would survive. He says, he tells the story of his 8-year-old brother and says, "I saw 2 men carrying my brother out of the house. I just heard the explosions and ran to see what happened. They were carrying Yahya in a blanket, and all I thought was, I need to go with him, my brother is alive." Ala had no idea what happened to the rest of his families, but he clung to the hope that Yahya at least would survive. He took his brother from the 2 men that had pulled him out of the house's courtyard, cradled him in a blanket, and ran to find a taxi to take him to the nearby Kamal Adwan hospital. "I kept talking to him, telling him to be strong, to be patient." Ala was speaking, his eyes giving away that his voice would not. "I kept talking to him," he said, "but there was a big hole where his stomach used to be, and I couldn't figure out how to do it, how to hold his insides in." By the time they arrived to hospital, 8-year-old Yahya was barely breathing. Doctors immediately shuttled him to an ambulance, which rushed off to Gaza City's Al-Shifa hospital. Although the better-equipped hospital was already overwhelmed with patients, Yahya could at least stand a chance of surviving there. He didn't. By the time Ala got the news, he had just heard that the rest of his family, his father, his mother, and his 6 sisters were gone too. International law stipulates that locations typically used for civilian purposes are not legitimate targets in military combat. During July and August, Israeli forces bombed and shelled homes, hospitals, and schools in Gaza. The scores of civilian deaths are not collateral damages. They are war crimes. So with that also, I would just like to tell the story, the final story, of a father who, during one of the brief ceasefire moments, decided to take his 3 daughters to their home to see whether their home was still standing and to try and salvage some of their belongings. So his name is Saleh, and Saleh had to take a split-second decision that no mother or father should ever experience. His decision was when he took his daughters to an area in Gaza where there was a ceasefire at the time, they started looking through their house, and about an hour into looking for their belongings, the ceasefire broke down and heavy shelling resumed. They realized if they would stay in the house, they would soon meet their deaths. So the father quickly decided to evacuate with his daughters. But he had heard that so many families had been killed in single incidents, and because they were all together. So he thought what he wanted to do was send his eldest daughter with a neighbor and take his two younger daughters so that if one of them was hit, at least the others might survive. And as they were making their way down Salah al-Din Street in Gaza, they came under heavy shelling. And Saleh was carrying both of his daughters and turned around to see his daughter had fallen into a ditch on the ground. She had been injured, but he thought, my neighbor's still by her, and if I went back for her, I would be risking the lives of my two daughters. He had to rush to the nearest hospital carrying his daughters. And there he had to convince the paramedics to come back with him to try and find his daughter's body and try to save her. When they went back, his daughter's body was missing. They didn't find her for another 3 days, and they found her dead. She had two large caliber bullets, one in the neck and one in the shoulder, and she had been killed. And after she had died, some Hamas members had moved her out of the way so that she wouldn't continue to be hit and wouldn't continue laying in the ditch. But that's why the family couldn't find the daughter for 3 days. In Gaza, there are currently, if you're a child in Gaza and you're 8 years old or older, then you've lived through, this would be your third such military operation. And so the trauma is just recurring time and time again. Just from this conflict alone, 373,000 children will require psychosocial support. That's a huge number that no one neither the international NGOs nor the current infrastructure in Gaza or even in the West Bank is ready or prepared to deal with providing the support that these 373,000 children need. Psychological damage will continue indefinitely. Children like Mohammed Baroud, 12, who lost both his feet in an explosion that killed 11 of his neighbors, will require lifelong medical care. Gaza's infrastructure is so devastated that children needing treatment will be forced to wait while hospitals are repaired and re-equipped. Many have lost parents and other relatives, sometimes their entire extended families. All have experienced violence, fear, and instability at close quarters. In fact, Ahmed Tawfiq Ahmed Abu Jamir, an 8-year-old boy from Khan Yunis, survived 5 previous Israeli military offenses. This July, Ahmed died in an airstrike that killed 25 members of his family, 18 of whom were children. These children, even if they survive this time around, until there's a long-term solution, there's no guarantee that they will survive the next time around. And what's particularly frustrating for an organization like mine, which is called Defense for Children International, is that there's really no defense that you could provide these children in these situations. And all we can try and do is to document these violations, to expose them, and to ask for long-term change so that we wouldn't have this situation reoccur. Those who have suffered most inevitably say the least. It is a hallmark of victims everywhere. But here in the steaming coastal enclave, the reminders of Palestinian dispossession, of repeated Israeli assault, leave the grief-stricken in a state of permanent shock. And we saw that shock time and time again with Ala, with a lot of these children that I've just been mentioning to you today. And for a generation of young Palestinians, this trauma will create a mindset that can only serve to move the region further away from a lasting peace, from the peace that we all here sit and talk about. And how could you have that peace if you don't have that justice, if you don't assure these kids that this situation will not reoccur? And those in Gaza who are children now will take their scars into adulthood, almost certainly shaping the trajectory of the conflict in years to come. So unless we take a stand now, unless we take real action and try to change the situation in Gaza, try to lift the blockade, which actually an Israeli general recently admitted wasn't working out for them, and therefore they might need to reevaluate the blockade. But we need to really be strong about the fact that unless you lift the blockade, allow emergency assistance to get into Gaza and get into Gaza to the amount that it's needed, that these children will continue to suffer. And what bothers me is that since, during the war, there was extreme coverage of the conflict. You could see the conflict everywhere. But the war has now been over for less than 2 months, and it's nowhere in the media. What's happening to these 373,000 children, the 1,500 completely orphaned, the 107,000 that don't have homes anymore, no one's hearing about them. And that's extremely problematic. And it just means organizations like mine and people like you have to continue to share these stories so that they don't die out in the media, and so that world leaders and organizations pay attention and try and get that help through. With that, I'll end. Thank you. Yeah.